Hello everyone. This video essay is on Final Fantasy VII, and in it, I'll be going in depth on various aspects of the game. I'd recommend playing it before watching any further for spoiler reasons and, more importantly, to have a frame of reference to understand the material. This is the 9th of 10 analyses in a retro-analysis series I'm working on, and as I've done with every previous game covered, I'll be looking at Final Fantasy VII from the perspective of what it tried to accomplish. And for Final Fantasy VII, that means expanding a beloved series, garnering a larger audience, pushing technological innovations, and, most importantly of all, reaching the hearts of players. Before getting to the game, I'll first be exploring its historical context, and then, before this video is over, I'll take time out to discuss something special it has to offer game design going forwards. If this is the first retro analysis you're watching, I've left links to my previous videos in the description box below. I'm Icer Aesthetics, and this is Final Fantasy VII. In 1997, Squaresoft released Final Fantasy VII on the PlayStation 1 to immense public and critical acclaim. This occurred during the 5th generation of video game consoles. Undoubtedly, one of the most interesting era for the medium, as it saw the old rulebooks being thrown out the window while the industry was trying desperately to get a grip on the paradigm shift brought about by 3D polygons. When discussing the history of Final Fantasy VII, it's impossible not to bring up Sony. When the game started development, Final Fantasy and Squaresoft itself were for all intents and purposes properties of Nintendo. Square had been with Nintendo since the late 80s, so it was safe to assume that the N64 would be the home to the first 3D Final Fantasy game, and certainly not the PlayStation newcomer. And this was Square's plan. But when the developers started on the game, they quickly realized that the N64 would not be up to the task performance-wise, so Square started to consider a deal with Sony, which had contacted them some time ago. What Sony offered was a larger distribution network and a much better per-unit royalty payment than Nintendo, because of their comparatively cheap CD-based storage system. After ironing out a deal, it was decided that Square would be jumping ship, and in retrospect, this is a bold move. Today, Sony and Square are seen as a natural partnership. But back then, Sony was still getting their feet wet in this industry, and for Square, this could have been thought of as company suicide. But taking big chances was nothing new for Square, and if the rumors about Nintendo CEO Hiroshi Yamauchi's almost tyrannical approach to leadership are true, the move makes a lot of sense. Of course, Square has always denied those rumors and stated communication problems and the aforementioned hardware limitation when pressed on the issue. The decision to move to PlayStation brought a very icy nature to Nintendo and Square's relationship for years to come, which was great news for Sony, since not only did they get publishing rights to Final Fantasy VII, but they got a long and mutually beneficial partnership with one of the industry's finest developers. The final contract netted Sony 6 Squaresoft exclusives in exchange for them floating the bill to Final Fantasy VII's marketing campaign, which was the most expensive this industry had seen at that point. Even though Sony was a global juggernaut, not many people believed in the PlayStation when it first arrived. They claimed it looked like a toilet and that Sony's plan for third-party support was doomed to fail. Since Square had burnt their bridge with Nintendo, they needed the PlayStation to be successful, in both Japan and the West. Before this game launched, Square's revenue was 95% local. That is to say, the Japanese market was responsible for 95% of the company's profits. Old industry rumors suggest that to guarantee PlayStation's success, Square went as far as meeting with Konami and Capcom executives to have them consider moving to PlayStation as well. If this is true, then it was obviously lucrative for Sony, and it showcases a developer mindset that no longer exists. Square's insistence on staying on a single console came from their perception that multi-platform releases would incite competition against themselves. For this mentality to make sense, remember that this young industry had, in just a few years, seen the natural breakup of both the Atari monopoly and the Nintendo monopoly. Such a chaotic marketplace naturally breeds conservative policies. In a way, it would be fair to say that Final Fantasy VII's lasting legacy was solidifying PlayStation's place in the industry, and, while I believe that to be somewhat true of the game's external value, I think there's a lot more to it than just that. Final Fantasy VII's success changed the expectations people had. It was a seminal hit, rivaled only in significance by the likes of Super Mario 64, Half-Life, and Metal Gear Solid. The actual development of the game is a story which sees a 20 dev team balloon into over 100 developers, which was at that time an industry record. And the amazing thing about the development is that as soon as it got started, it had a fairly quick turnaround time. The original production got set back because the team was siphoned away to complete Chrono Trigger. The second attempt, however, saw the team spending their first months mastering the new 3D technology, after which the formal development began, and it saw the now legendary Tetsuya Nomura step up to become the leading character designer after having impressed his producer, the also legendary Hironobu Sakaguchi. All in all, if we discount the time spent making the original SNES prototype and calculate only the post-Chrono Trigger hiatus development time, then the game was designed in 2 years. Considering that the game ran on new hardware with brand new technology, that time period is pretty amazing. In interviews surrounding the release of the game, the developers were always quick to bring up the autonomy they had with this project. Some going as far as saying there was no real director. That can be a recipe for disaster, but everyone was on top of their game for this one. The enormous staff created each piece of the game separately, and each element was worked on to perfection. Then, in the end, the pieces were put together to form a cohesive whole. The hurdle Sony had to get through on the marketing side was the perceived notion that Western audiences would not play turn-based RPGs because of how slow they were. The success of this game proved that notion wrong, so we can throw popularizing JRPGs in the West onto the pile of Final Fantasy VII's lasting legacies. The last major one of those I haven't discussed is the role it played in vindicating 3D graphics in games, but I'll get more into that later on. Ultimately, Final Fantasy VII has gone to sell well over 11 million copies across multiple platforms on a budget of roughly $40 million, making it the most expensive game the world had seen at that point in time. Now, with a better idea of the landscape back then, before I go any further, I want to emphasize that Final Fantasy VII was not designed to be, nor is it, a perfect game. Placing the game on that pedestal would make it impossible to have a real discussion about it, which is why I'm taking this stance early on. With that in mind, know that the rest of this essay excludes all external Final Fantasy VII media and will cover exclusively what Final Fantasy VII brings to the table, starting with the story. Final Fantasy VII's major theme is life. That decision came about when Hironobu Sakaguchi's mother passed away, leaving him with an immense interest in understanding life down to a mathematical level. To him, there's a very simple equation to it. Something comes to life, lives, then returns to its source, to be cleansed of the individuality acquired in life and prepared for this cycle to start over again. This is shown in-game as the Lifestream. Great fantasy universes tend to include unique items or phenomena which enable the storyteller to delve into the characters in interesting ways. Examples include the Force from Star Wars and the One Ring from Lord of the Rings. In Final Fantasy VII, it's the Lifestream, and it's used to give us scenes like this one in Cloud's mind. The Lifestream resides deep within the planet and gives life to everything on it. Because of this line, spoken by Bugenhagen, we can look at the collective life on the planet as a single creature and Jenova as a disease. Jenova represents the biggest immediate danger to the planet. It arrived on it 2,000 years ago, leaving behind a massive crater, which is still unhealed, then started wreaking havoc only to finally be subdued by the Cetra, who can be thought of as a race of earth-loving elves. Long after this event, but before the plot of the game begins, humans discovered the remains of Jenova and started experimenting with it, thinking it was the now nearly extinct Cetra. Humans have at this point learned to harness the Lifestream as Mako energy and want the Cetra to lead them to a land filled with it. Thus, their aforementioned experimentations created Sephiroth by implanting Jenova cells into a human fetus. On the surface, the story is wrapped around an environmental message where harmonious planet lovers are good, killing the planet for profits not so much. But in reality, it's a story about people, or more specifically, about the nature of humanity. The Cetra represent what the humans could be if they learned to live with the planet in harmony. Jenova represents what the humans will likely become if they don't change their ways, killing their host planet and being forced to move on to new worlds. Now, in spite of what it might sound like with the fetus experiments, Final Fantasy VII has a lot of heart and its tone is consistently whimsical. Very whimsical. There's actually something to be said about the story's pacing. It knows exactly when to be tense and when to be relaxed. Just look at the opening chapter. In the game's opening, the player assumes the role of Cloud Strife, who's part of a terrorist organization named Avalanche on his way to blow up a Mako reactor. The player takes control after watching a, at the time groundbreaking, cutscene seamlessly transition into gameplay. The music and the dialogue from Barrett urges the player to move quickly, and since this opening is in medias res, the player doesn't necessarily know why they're doing what they're doing. That creates an air of mystery which gets the player's mind engaged. After the bombing is successful, the terrorist group leaves, and on their way back to the hideout, the player meets a flower girl named Aerith. The journey to the hideout is quieter than the opening infiltration, and instead of getting the player engaged like the opening did, it shows them a wider view of the world. When everyone has reached the hideout, the player is given the opportunity to stretch their legs a bit. Things have slowed down, so they're able to ask some questions, familiarizing themselves with the world. During this lull, Tifa and Marlene are introduced and used as a means of humanizing Barrett, who had up until that point been an angry terrorist. Tifa also serves as a convenient tool the player can use to familiarize themselves with the world, seeing as she's more interested in engaging with Cloud than Barrett has been. For gameplay purposes, the opening tutorial is nothing to write home about, but it does its job. The player's input scheme is mostly mapped out within 30 minutes, plus they understand how the game lays out towns and have gotten the chance to rename the 3 most important characters in the story if they felt like it. The real strength of the opening, however, is how it changes pace and tone to elegantly set up the world and the characters. This was the developer's real goal, as is evident by how the materia tutorial is framed. Barrett asks Cloud to explain to him how it works. It's a binary choice with an option to let the player not explain it in order to save time, but the point is, it's presented as a character moment. This is the best kind of tutorial this game has to offer, where the gameplay explanation is wrapped around characters engaging one another. Unfortunately, it's not how most tutorials go down, but then I guess it'd be weird for Barrett and Cloud to have a discussion on how Cloud should walk, so dispersing these moments out makes some sense. After getting around to everything they want to do in Sector 7, the player is able to start another reactor infiltration, but this one will go awry, which will lead to the team being separated and Cloud meeting Aerith again. To release the tension built up in the second bombing mission, there's some wackiness added to Aerith's introduction, with Cloud dropping barrels on men trying to capture her. After which, the two go to Aerith's home where her adoptive mother is introduced. There's some drama between Aerith and Cloud when he leaves in the middle of the night, but the two are quickly brought back together for the infamous cross-dressing section. It's a weird addition to the game, and it really comes out of nowhere, but it does have some payoff. It serves to humanize Cloud and to give his and Aerith's relationship something to build on. It's also another example of a drastic tonal shift, which is probably the only way the game got away with showcasing the seedy underbelly of Midgar as dirty as it is. The two meet Tifa in the house of Don Corneo, then after escaping, they return to Sector 7 to find that it's under attack by Shinra. Atop a spiraling tower, Barret is fighting them off, so Cloud and Tifa decide to go up to help him. But on their way up the tower, they meet the three other Avalanche members and catch a glimpse of their final moments. After reaching the top, they help Barret only to then suffer the loss of their homes when Shinra collapses a plate on the entire sector, and the temporary loss of Aerith as Shinra has kidnapped her. The story has had up and downs up until this point, but nothing quite like this. The destruction of Sector 7 serves as motivation for the team to attack Shinra HQ, which is the climax to this first chapter of the story. The climax is a slow build-up as the team slowly goes up to the top of Shinra HQ, an in-game presentation of the story's page, which will be a recurring thing in this game. Near the top floor, the team is introduced to Hojo, a mad scientist, and Red 13, a new team member. Before leaving the tower, the team saves Aerith, gets caught, and then witnesses the aftermath of a Sephiroth attack. Sephiroth, apparently fresh from the dead, killed President Shinra, which leads to Rufus taking control of the company. The climax to the engagement in Shinra HQ are some boss battles, and then an escape minigame wherein Cloud, on a motorcycle, must protect the rest of his team from Shinra forces. After reaching the city limits, the minigame ends and the team leaves the claustrophobic and dirty city of Midgar for the open world. In leaving, there are three things of note. 1. Midgar is shrouded in what are probably industrial fumes, which make the screen go darker whenever the player goes near it. 2. There's no vegetation around Midgar. That's environmental storytelling in the 5th gen signifying to us that there's pollution. And 3. Midgar looks like, and according to Naora, was designed after, a pizza. On the overworld, the game uses the 3D graphics to contrast with Midgar. Everything's more open and there's a sense of adventure. This is generally a net benefit of jumping to 3 dimensions. 2D games have a harder time letting the player take it all in because there's something about a flat, tiled image which doesn't read adventure. After the bombastic chasing from Shinra HQ, the team separates and promises to regroup. They do so in another lull in the story, which funnily enough happens in a town literally named Calm. This marks the moment in this game where the visual artists start to release the restraints placed on them in the early game. Calm is cleaner with Tudor-style architecture which brings with it grids of whites and deep blues. Quite a contrast from the dirty grime in Midgar. This also marks the first appearance of Sephiroth in Cloud's retelling of the Nibelheim incident as he remembers it. Up until this moment in the story, the player had only heard of him and seen his work. The best video game characters tend to have some thought put into how the player will perceive them, and to introduce Sephiroth, the player plays through the Nibelheim incident. It starts by showcasing Sephiroth as a likable enough party member who's powerful enough to carry the player through combat. It's one thing to have the characters talk about how powerful he is, but this showcase of his strength tells the player a lot more since they have a frame of reference to the scale of power here. They know that dealing 3,000 points of damage is a big deal because they've likely not even hit the 1,000 mark at this point. The rest of the Nibelheim incident does a good job characterizing Cloud and Sephiroth, making it so that both of their motives are known to the player And when Cloud is done telling the story, there's a small touch I really like wherein Tifa is very out of characterly quiet. The next objective is to catch a chocobo, so the team can run through an area housing a Midgar Zolom, a rare enemy in that the engagement with them is telegraphed beforehand. When they've gotten past it, they'll be treated to the spectacle of Sephiroth's solution to them. The chocobos are to some people the highlight of the entire game. I never got super into them, but understand the appeal and see how they add a lot of value to a lot of players. The player can breed and raise chocobos to eventually acquire a golden chocobo which can traverse any surface and access various hidden areas housing some interesting goodies. This means the chocobos add a completionist element to the game, which does a lot for the seemingly small task of including them. The linear nature of the opening in Midgar never truly leaves, but the remainder of the story has some tricks to hide it away, like casting it as physical obstacles. The mountain ranges and oceans act as hidden walls. Couple that with the expansive scope of the story and it makes sense for the developers to have included vehicles in the game. Since each one unlocks more access to the world's terrain, story progression is mechanically linked to the vehicular variety the player has at their disposal. In total, there are 7 transport methods on the overworld. There's walking, riding a chocobo, taking the boat in Junon, the buggy, the tiny bronco, the high wind, and the submarine. The inclusion of these multiple vehicles also has a positive side effect, which is that the player thinks about the terrain as more than just polygons and texture. The world feels more real when different terrain demands a different way to traverse it, because there's a cognitive element in that approach. The true testament to the success of this design choice is actually the fact that it goes completely unnoticed, whilst providing a lot of value. Another positive side effect is that because of the immense difference between walking in the early game and flying in the late game, the player is constantly being rewarded for progressing in the story, and by structuring the player's access to the world to increase the more they play, they start to mentally overcome the perceived linearity so prevalent in the early game. It's why Final Fantasy VII feels so open in spite of being 95% predetermined. I guess what I'm trying to say is that the bond between the player and the world has an arc. The worlds in the Final Fantasy series had up until this point always been some form of high fantasy. Final Fantasy VII also has a high fantasy setting, but like its series predecessor Final Fantasy VI, it takes place after that world's industrial revolution. There's still the whole magic of the land, but where there used to be wizards who channeled it, there are now just tubes which suck it up from the ground to generate electricity. There are still monsters, but they're more human than magic. There are no evil sorcerers, but there's an evil genetic experiment in Sephiroth which pretty much fills that void. I've heard the term post-industrial fiction applied to the world, but I think a more apt description would be post-industrial fantasy. The world follows the used universe concept popularized by movies like Star Wars and Alien, which makes it so the world seems lived in. But Final Fantasy VII takes that philosophy and cranks it up to 11, where not only is this world lived in, but certain places feel like they're mere days from falling apart from overuse. You look at a screen like this and you can practically smell the fumes and rusted metal. Somehow it feels wrong to the eye, which is good because the dynamic of man versus nature is very prevalent in this game, and the height of that theme is seen when comparing Midgar to the Forgotten Capital. Men made steel cobble and smoking alleyways their homes, whilst the peaceful Cetra seem to have been content to live with the planet instead of domesticating it. As I said earlier, there's a big environmental message in this game, but it's more than that. There's a mature, non-politically motivated environmental message, which is all too rare to see these days. Nothing about Final Fantasy VII feels like an activist group or marketing board pushing an agenda. It feels like a creative endeavor, something from the heart as opposed to just trying to teach kids recycling. As with the aforementioned utility of the town calm presenting quiet time in the story, many other locations are designed mainly to deliver the story to another level, whether tonally or pacing-wise. Areas like Junon show the might and destructive influence of Shinra, which emphasizes how underpowered the protagonists really are. The boat section immediately afterwards ratchets up the tension with another appearance of Sephiroth, and then the arrival in Casa del Sol showcases the characters in a tropical vacation setting to ease things down again. Something the landscape diversity accomplishes is to characterize the team members, and what presenting flashbacks and tying specific party members to specific areas in the story accomplishes is to get the player invested in their team. The former works by playing on the breadth of visual variety. We can characterize the individuals in the story by comparing what we know to be their natural environment with their current environment. Aerith in a brothel means more when we know from her introduction as a flower salesgirl, the arrival in the church, and from her house that her natural environment is flowers. The latter works because the story is still always centered on the characters. The party system enables the developers to use this structure to delve a bit deeper into each of them without muddling the actual pace of the game. By today's standards, the overworld is very charming, with houses and towns strewn about, and this is something that's best appreciated in proper context. It's reasonable to assume that the player would not have experienced anything near the scope of Final Fantasy VII back in 1997. That also means they were likelier to forgive the game for how it handles difficulty scaling. Enemies on the overworld grow more dangerous the further the player progresses. This makes sense gameplay-wise, since it keeps the game challenging, but it also makes it so that the rabbits in the north are more powerful than soldiers to the east. I don't want to be completely cynical, and I understand the desire of the developers to want to vary up the fauna, but I feel exclusively using monsters as enemies in these scenarios would be justifiable if the developers would maybe have worked the lesser animals, like the rabbits, into the battle backgrounds or something. That way, they could have created a vibrant world without these battles popping up, and it would play at least as well to the theme of life. You know, this characterization of the game's handling of combat is negative, but actually, Final Fantasy VII transcends a problem that a lot of RPGs don't, which is that, after roughly the halfway mark, the combat doesn't lose any of its luster. In lesser role-playing games, that often happens because they break up playtime of movement and story with combat, and to get the player interested in their progress, those games include the traditional experience bar without considering the full ramifications of including it. The mistake that often pops up in those games is that difficulty in combat is literally scaled to predicted player skill or character strength. This is a problem because it makes the progressive difficulty curve linear, so the combat's only visible change is the numbers on display, and that can't maintain the player's interest for long. Some of the best action RPGs, Final Fantasy VII included, solve this problem by, instead of scaling for difficulty, using the game's halfway mark to smoothly transitioning into adding more variety to the combat. Final Fantasy VII's late-game combat includes a variety of status ailment attacks and makes great use of the materia system, but more on that later. As I nitpicked earlier, there is the rabbit problem, but all things considered, I'd say Final Fantasy VII's handling of combat scaling leaves little to be desired and might actually be great at supporting the world. On traveling, to hide away the limited draw distance, the developers cast the map as an entire planet, which lets them hide the non-rendered section of the map behind the planet's natural curvature. Although the overworld map is clearly a square, it's a planet by asteroids rules. Pass to one end of the map and you'll spawn again in the corresponding spot on the other side of the map. Since there's no reward nor incentive to travel to the edge of the map, other than to see it, the non-issue of the actual spherical nature of the map is made into a larger non-issue, and this creative decision is more or less a complete success. Final Fantasy VII is a collection of concessions made to work in the developer's favor. A great example of this is the game's sound. The game's composer is one Nobuo Uematsu. Up until this game, he'd been shackled to comparatively primitive hardware, so it's natural to expect him to want to utilize this opportunity to showcase the dimensions of his musical capabilities, and while this game has breathtakingly beautiful music, he actually went out of his way to restrict himself, which I think highlights his discipline. First off, he opted to abandon the old philosophy, and instead of writing a score defined by a single melody, chose to write music that would fit better in the background while still feeling like a Final Fantasy score, and one which would serve to give the front seat to the 3D visuals. Those visuals brought with them a problem, which Uematsu mitigated with his ultimate concession. The problem was loading time. To speed up loading time, the music was made to load directly from the PlayStation's sound chip. That immensely decreased the sound quality, but according to Uematsu, it was a compromise which ensured a smoother experience, so it was worth making. In service of the team's aspirations of making a seamless cinematic experience, there was an effort to not include any repeat music. Each scene was intended to have its own feel, each character and each town, which brings me back to the game's world. If you look at the map as a grid, which the story is laid on, then the towns essentially act as nodes. They're where the action is, they're where most of the big moments take place, and to that end, their links to characters are an interesting design choice. Every party member except Vincent and Kachi has their personal story play out in a specific town. Cloud and Tifa have Nibelheim, Barrett has Corel, Red 13 has Cosmo Canyon, Sid has Rocket Town, Yuffie Wutai, and Aerith has Midgar. Now that's not saying Kachi and Vincent lack their own fleshing out moments. Vincent's is even tied to a specific area on the map, so if we were to extend the previous statement to say that each character except Kachi gets a specific environment to delve into their backstory, I think we'd still be correct. The game includes 9 possible party members, 7 mandatory and 2 optional. I like how the 9 slots foreshadow the 2 secret characters, and I love how after Aerith dies, she leaves behind a permanent empty spot for the player to see whenever they cycle through the character screen. What I'm not sure about is how far the game went in encouraging the player to bond with each character. On one hand, although the player gets to pick their party, it seems that for 90% of players, the game will consist exclusively of Cloud, Barrett, Tifa, Aerith, and Sid momentarily. On the other hand, if the game had dictated the party lineup all throughout, much of the expressive freedom the player has would be diminished. Let me explain. The story does not allow for much player expression, but the gameplay does, and in fact, the team the player gathers and how they customize each character is the actual interactive part of the game. So if the game had taken that freedom away from the player, much of what makes Final Fantasy VII special would be diminished. The system present is not perfect, but I think it avoids the major pitfalls of the 2 possible extremes. The player gets to choose their party for the most part. The game does make them experiment, but doesn't kill the player's momentum in doing so. What we end up with is a story broken up into segments wherein some of the towns are used to explore the characters. This makes the moments when they're forced into the active party more forgivable, since the game is doing it to move the story along, whilst also introducing the player to the nuance of each character and creating an experience in the separate towns. Before becoming optional characters, Yuffie and Vincent were going to be mandatory, but scheduling problems emerged, so they were temporarily cut. When it was realized that they could be fitted into the game, most of it was already complete. What I think happened in the intervening time was that their narrative responsibilities got dumped on Kachi. I say this not just because Kachi feels out of place in the game world, but because his moments of story significance would more naturally be filled by Vincent and Yuffie. It makes more sense for Vincent to be a Shinra spy than Kachi because Vincent was once affiliated with the Turks, and it makes more sense for Yuffie to steal the black materia in a more traditional heist scenario, seeing as he's a thief with an eye for materia. But instead, Kachi is being remotely controlled by a Shinra staffer named Reeve, and he obtains the black materia by sacrificing his toy body. This little theory is not backed up by any interview I could find, nor can I draw any realistic links between my conclusions and the dummied content from this game, so take this as the speculation it is. For the upcoming discussion on the characters, assume that their allotted purpose is twofold. 1. Their struggles and arcs emotionally engage the players, which 2. Gets them to buy into the fantasy. Their stories being presented by showcasing specific areas showcases the diversity of the team by the geographic and cultural variety of their points of origin, and since the player struggles with them in those areas, the areas themselves benefit greatly since the player will have an emotional attachment to them as well. Barrett's area is Corel, which he once had to escape from after it was attacked by Shinra forces. Barret is the first team member the player meets besides Cloud, and he's also the first presentation of the running theme of absent fathers in the game. When Corel was attacked, Barret thought his friend, a man named Dine, died, so he decided to adopt his daughter Marlene, and Marlene acts as the emotional guide to Barret's character. He will always act to benefit her interests, which is why he's an absent father. His duties as her protector makes him distance himself from her. Tifa's area is Nibelheim, and the reason she's on the journey is to be with Cloud. His false memories give her a reason for keeping an eye on him since they knew each other as children. After Aerith dies, Tifa steps up to become the main female protagonist, even briefly becoming team leader after Cloud disappears. The developers created her specifically for this purpose, because they knew the game would still need a strong female presence after Aerith was killed. When the team finds the catatonic Cloud, she decides to stay with him, so like Barret with Marlene, it's obvious to see that Tifa's motive is to act in Cloud's interests. Red 13's area is Cosmo Canyon, and his story showcases another side to the absent father theme. His perspective is that of the child. Red 13's father has been frozen as a statue for years ever since he stopped an attack on Cosmo Canyon. Red 13, being unaware of that part, thinks his father was a coward who ran away. This is resolved relatively shortly after his introduction to the team, but Red 13 avoids falling into the story's background because his grandfather, Bugenhagen, is the team's spiritual mentor. Sid's area is Rocket Town, and it's undeniably my favorite example of the used universe concept in this game. After Tifa leaves to be with the catatonic Cloud, Barret relegates his newfound leadership role to Sid. That moment in the story occurs after the ultimate low point, where Sephiroth had obtained the black materia, Tifa and Barret had just escaped an execution, and Cloud had just been found to be a vegetable. The moment where Sid is chosen as the leader is one of the story's highlights because it showcases that in spite of the immense opposition, the team can still come together. It really highlights the strength of the characters because most story-driven games could not get away with switching between 4 team leaders. Shortly after Sid becomes team leader, the player wins the turret defense game on Fort Condor, resulting in the large egg on top of the fort hatching and the old Condor dying. The team can then acquire the thematically fitting Phoenix materia. This section of the game accomplishes 2 things. 1, it reinforces the theme of life, but more important is number 2, it characterizes Sid as a strategically capable leader. Sid is very much a no-nonsense man, and his dream had always been to travel to outer space. When he's introduced, he's bitter that this opportunity was stolen from him. But in the hunt for the 4 huge materia, it comes to fruition. To get back to the planet, the team goes on an escape pod, and while he's in it, Sid realizes that the planet is just a kid in the vastness of space, and that the team's job is to protect it. Sid gets a lot of exposure in this game, so it's a good thing he's so charming and expressive. On the opposite end of that spectrum, we have Vincent. Where Sid is very much a foul-mouthed lover of science, Vincent is a quiet character and a victim of science. That's actually his motivation for joining the team. He wants revenge for what Professor Hojo did to him and a woman named Lucretia many years ago. It's a good thing the developers managed to add Vincent back into the story because it adds a personal conflict between the team and Hojo. Yuffie, the other optional character, is from Wutai, and as I mentioned earlier, she wants materia. A cocky 16-year-old, Yuffie has grown dissatisfied by her town being turned from a place of great honor to a tourist attraction. Her story is not as optional to explore as Vincent's, since his story requires that the player actively searches for it, whereas Yuffie's story is pretty much a must-see, since the player will lose their materia if they start it and don't finish. Yuffie stealing the team's materia is a fun way to make the player care. If she had stolen their gil, they might say it wasn't worth the hassle to chase after her, but the materia they can't do without as easily. Yuffie, much like Red 13, also has a feud with her father, which is resolved by the end of her story. The team's cultural diversity grants their unity some gravitas, since all walks of life are uniting to stop Sephiroth. Since the player's link to the story are the characters in their party, it was a wise decision to use them as a means to bring the player and the world closer together, and because each character is given a town to flesh them out, the journey is very much a bonding experience. Even though she's not the main character, of all of them, Aerith has arguably the most care taken into designing her from both visual and mechanical perspective. But to understand what that fully entails, how Final Fantasy VII utilizes its mechanics to drive player behavior in general needs to be discussed first. For the most part, Final Fantasy VII is not a great test of player skill, but that's okay. It's not supposed to be a challenging game, but rather it uses the mechanics to build a bond between the player and the characters. Because of that bond, the player is able to further appreciate the story and the lessons it entails. The game has 4 essential states of play. There's traveling, fighting, talking, and minigames. Traveling is a system that is so simple, your grandma could pick it up by watching a given scene of this game. That being said, there's an implementation here I want to talk about, which is area-specific direction mapping. The PlayStation 1 controller did not originally have a joystick, and the control scheme of this game's movement was designed around the D-pad. Because of how rigid that makes it, the movement scheme doesn't gel perfectly with the developer's focus on cinematic angles, and what we got feels like a compromise which enables the camera angles to work but sometimes makes it hard to read exactly where a specific direction button is actually pointing. Because there's no rigid consistency with the direction mapping, the rigid movement scheme can become problematic. An example of this is in Casa del Sol, which plays like it's had its direction layout rotated 45 degrees and vertically flipped in the middle, so that pushing up will always direct the player to the middle of the upper screen. In retrospect, it might have felt better to play this game with tank controls, but since a big reason the developers chose 3D was the expressive character animations it provided, it's understandable that they didn't want the walking looking clunky. While walking, the entire team is presented solely by the party leader. This was a Final Fantasy series staple, used to preserve graphical performance. Another series staple is in the combat. Battles emerge without the player and enemies visibly colliding, because enemies are for the most part not presented outside of combat. The fights themselves occur in special screens, and all of these design choices were to some extent informed by a desire to keep the polygon count to a minimum. The special combat screens are not very impressive by today's standards, but consider that the North American release of Pokemon was still a year away, so to many Westerners, Final Fantasy VII was their first taste of turn-based combat. Unlike on the overworld, the battles showcase the entire team, each enemy, and the backgrounds, and it does it all in 3D. The model quality of the team was increased for the battle screens, and conversely, the battle backgrounds were created by taking the original world render models and compressing them. As I stated earlier in this essay, the general consensus before this game launched was that Westerners wouldn't latch on to JRPGs because the combat was too slow. After Final Fantasy VII launched, the industry saw that this was untrue and then, as it often does, learned the wrong lesson. The lesson the industry learned was that long battle animations with little to no interaction was the wave of the future. What the industry should have learned was that slow combat invites more methodical play, which in turn can make actions more meaningful. The combat in Final Fantasy VII achieved that with the inclusion of limit breaks, character-specific weapons, the row mechanic, and materia. Limit breaks are super moves which rely on a limit break meter being full to activate. To fill one up, a character must take damage. This showcases the team as scrappy and resourceful. The limit breaks are very much the characters expressing their refusal to give in. It showcases their strength during adversity, and every character's limit break is to some extent an expression of their personality. Barret is destructive, Aerith is a healer. As for the character-specific weapons, they impose a limitation on the player's ability to express themselves as the characters, which makes the player's approach to utilizing them focus on what those specific characters bring to the table. That being said, there's also some customizability because weapons vary not only in strength but in utility. Some weapons are stronger than others, but offer fewer materia slots or have a slower XP growth rate. Finally, the character-specific weapons go some way in helping the characters maintain their individuality by letting the player interact with the role mechanic. Characters placed in front deal and take more damage than characters placed in the back, who take less damage and, if they're melee, deal less damage too. A favorite strategy of mine was playing with the cover materia. The cover materia allows the equipped upon character to absorb attacks, and if they're in the back, then the player is funneling enemy attacks to a more guarded target. This is in no way immensely deep, but it's satisfying to do. The materia open up a whole range of satisfying to do strategies, and with skillful application, the player can use them to dominate any battle. In total, there are 5 materia types. There are summons, magic, command, support, and independence. Summons are pretty straightforward. They summon entities which deal immense damage at the cost of immense MP. Aside from the FMVs, the summons are probably the most animation-intensive scenes in the entire game. In-game, summons are not explained, but there is a cut line spoken by Sephiroth which says that during the times of the Ancients, the planet created beings that sealed their life energy in materia. I said in the beginning of this video that I was excluding external content, so you can make up your own mind on the validity of that origin. But if it's true, it's probable that this happened around the time the planet created the kaiju weapons. Magic materia grants the characters access to a lot of elemental and status-altering magic. Command materia give the characters additional combat commands. These include the enemy skill materia and the steel materia. Those two materia are great because they incentivize playground discussions. The enemy skill materia is a checklist of unique enemy attacks to be subjected to, and the steel materia can grant the player some useful items or powerful equipment, especially early on. The support materia's function is to supplement the effect of other materia. The most obvious example is the all materia, which increases the number of targets for the equipped materia to dish out at. Finally, independent materia add support abilities without needing to be paired with other materia. This is my personal favorite type because they're mostly passive game changers. Examples of independent materia are cover and counterattack. There are few things as immersion breaking as mechanics which cease to exist during a game's story segment. But unlike Phoenix Down, the materia are wisely integrated into the story. According to Sephiroth, materia contains the knowledge of the ancients. Anyone with this knowledge can freely use the powers of the land. That knowledge interacts between the people and the planet, calling up the magic. The most powerful materia in this game is either black materia or white materia. The black materia is the object of Sephiroth's desire. With it, he can call upon a meteor to crash into the planet, which will result in the Lifestream being funneled in to heal it. When the Lifestream has emerged, Sephiroth plans to be at the center of the impact zone, so that he can merge with the Lifestream to become a god. After manipulating Cloud into handing it over to him, he enacts his plan and sends Cloud on a journey that will culminate in the full exploration of Cloud's identity. The planet's only salvation is the white materia, which belongs to Aerith. She's carried it with her since she was a little girl without knowing what it did. When she does learn, she uses it to cast a spell called Holy, which has the power to stop the meteor. This throws a wrench into Sephiroth's plan, so he kills her and then blocks the spell from activating. Sephiroth then seals himself within a protective energy barrier just in time before the planet, sensing an imminent threat, awakens the weapons. The weapons were created long ago to combat Genova, and this time their job is to eradicate any threat facing the planet, which the weapons might understandably consider to be the humans. The weapons are formidable, with both Ruby Weapon and Emerald Weapon being more challenging boss battles than Sephiroth. This does undermine his status as the big baddie, but it makes sense gameplay-wise because of the old optional content should be harder than mandatory content argument. Both of those two boss battles were dummy content which was restored for the Western release of the game. The fact that they're still canonical makes me think that the cut line from Sephiroth about summons can be taken to be canonical as well. Final Fantasy VII was greatly inspired by and was a direct attempt at making a video game eclipse the storytelling capabilities of cinema. The weapons are no doubt based on cinema legend Godzilla. Godzilla is a metaphor for the atomic bomb and showcases the destructive capabilities of man when left unchecked. That theme is very applicable to Final Fantasy VII, so this inspiration makes a lot of sense. Final Fantasy VII's combat is an enormous subject, and because of that, I feel inclined to remind those of you still watching that we're going over the 4 primary states of play as a primer to a proper discussion on Aerith. The third primary state of play is talking, and it's handled with text boxes. Final Fantasy VII launched before voice acting became practically mandatory and benefited greatly from doing so. In previous videos, I've never shied away from championing text boxes over voice acting because they give the player more control over the pace at which they absorb the narrative. Even if they aren't interactive, they offer more dynamic storytelling than voice acting, because there is more than one reading speed as opposed to only one listening speed. The fourth primary state of play is the minigames, and the mandatory minigames in this game are varied enough to never become boring. There are some optional ones, like the Mock House Nut game, which is about as interesting as feeding a weird rat thing some seeds, but the mandatory story-driven minigames always serve their allotted purpose. Whether it be the high-stakes car chase out of Midgar, the tension-breaking chocobo race, snowboarding section, or the treasure digging game. Overall, I'd say the minigames as an implementation are a resounding success. They vary up the gameplay and help the story smoothly transition to a new tone. Traveling, fighting, talking, and minigames are the 4 primary methods by which this game is played. There's a case to be made that a 5th playstate exists in fiddling around with a menu, but there's very little of note about that which I haven't discussed already. There's really only one important mechanic left to discuss, but because that mechanic is so directly tied to the characters, it's better appreciated after capping off our Aerith discussion. While the game was in development, Aerith was designed to be a tragic character. Her music was supposed to invoke sad beauty. Her backstory involves losing her parents and being an outcast because of her ability to speak to the planet. Her introduction hints towards this as the player sees a flower salesgirl in the polluted streets of Midgar. When she eventually joins the party, she stands out mostly by her utility in combat. Aerith's limit breaks are not offensive attacks, but rather support spells. She has a healing spell, enemy ailing spell, cure spell, limit break filling spell, invincibility spell, another healing spell, and finally, another healing spell which also fills MP and makes the team temporarily invincible. When she's not in combat, Aerith is a likable and quirky girl with a big heart, and outside the game, she's a beloved video game icon, whose death consistently ranks as one of the medium's most important moments. It occurs at the end of Disc 1, so pacing-wise, it has some gravitas, and story-wise, it occurs during Cloud's struggle with his own identity. But those two things were not enough to make her death meaningful, and they aren't the reason her death was included. See, the story's underlying theme is life, and as we know, the cycle of life must include death. If the game hadn't covered it, the exploration of the game's central theme would be left wanting. Therefore, the developers decided to kill off a party member. It was actually decided upon to kill all but 3 party members near the end drop into Midgar, but Tetsuya Nomura, the great man, talked some sense into the other developers, reasoning that those deaths would lessen the effect of Aerith's. What makes her death work so well on the mechanical side is that up until that point, she'd been an immensely useful team member. As stated earlier, the limit break meter increases when the characters take damage. That setup incentivizes the player to let the characters take some damage, resulting in them needing ways to replenish lost health, and the game offered such a choice early on in Aerith. This is pretty manipulative if you ask me, but I think it's downright genius. If the player chooses to utilize her in the team, they'll spend the first portion of the game having to balance the team dynamic around Cloud and Aerith, which means that when she died, the player is forced to reconsider the game on a mechanical level. On the story side of things, Aerith's death removes much of the innocence the game had. The date scene in the Golden Saucer decides which character will be Cloud's date with a hidden point system. The character who has the most points will be Cloud's date, and when the game starts, Aerith has a 20-point lead on the runner-up, so it's safe to say the developers intended that scene to most often have Cloud and Aerith. The two go on a play which is joyous, but afterwards, Cloud and Aerith go on a gondola ride, and it's where we see a lot of maturity from these block figures. And if you were a kid reading this text, you were being exposed to something that might resonate years later. Aerith's death occurs underneath the Forgotten City, which was home to the Cetron. As I said earlier, their city is integrated into the land, which adds a sense of purity to them. Aerith is perhaps the purest character in the game, and being the last Cetra, her personality gels really well with the information displayed in the visuals of the Cetra's old home. It helps assign her some purity traits via association. A fun fact, in retrospect, is that up until this portion of the game, she was the only character who wasn't driven by a selfish motivation. Cloud wanted to settle the score with Sephiroth. Tifa wanted to keep an eye on Cloud. Barrett wanted to get revenge for Sector 7, etc. But from the beginning and up until the end, Aerith just wanted to save the planet. When she's killed off, the player is punished if they'd taken her for granted up until that point. If they had leaned on her instead of constructing a solid healing system, they'll be forced to implement changes to their playstyle. The mechanical flexibility she offered the player is gone, so they must learn to adapt. They need to, in a real sense, move on. But even after her death, her presence still lingers. When the team learns that she managed to cast Holy before her death, they're brought together by the hope she gave them, and with a common motivation, they're able to rally and take the battle to Sephiroth. There was a lot of care taken into designing Aerith. Actually, that's true about almost every character, so them still working 20 years later starts to make a lot of sense. The game goes out of its way to make the player care about almost every main character. They get invested in the world because they see it from so many different perspectives, and because the game so elegantly walks the tightrope of making the characters stand out while still allowing the player to express themselves with them, they're made all the more resonant for it. As I got through explaining earlier, the game's mechanics are in general fairly simple, but in that simplicity, they are versatile enough to guide the player through a range of emotions. Strong player-character bonds are not as prevalent as they were back in the day. We have deeper characters, but the mechanics with which the player bonds with them are very samey across all platforms. Not as many unique paths for the player to travel into the mind of the characters today as there once were. There's a mechanic in Final Fantasy VII which was very ubiquitous 15 to 25 years ago, which I want to talk about because I think we're ready to see it return. This mechanic is arguably the greatest player investment builder in game design history, and even though it's near universally hated, I'd like to take some time away to make a case for manual save points. It's weird to think about, but saving progress used to be a genuine mechanic before auto-saving killed it. If the developers spread the save points about, they could effectively use them to balance against difficulty. Developers could also force the player to be conscious of save points because the players would use them to keep track of their progress. If the developers did their job right, when the player needed to make dedicated choices in regards to their continual progression, they'd base their decision on the resource costs of the path already traveled and their predictions of what they had waiting for them. This meant that the developers could use the save points to create tension cycles for fitting intervals in the story. Save point location, level design, and enemy difficulty could be tweaked to elicit dread and stress from the player. The player might then attribute those feelings to the story, so the save points essentially elevated. Not to mention how the tension increases the player's cognitive investment in their progress, thus bringing with it more immersion. Something else on save points, the developers can use them to keep the player playing. Final Fantasy VII save points are carefully located with regard to the story. Usually, they're either found during the biggest lulls or just around bombastic moments. The anticipation of coming events and the relief of succeeding to the save points can get the player too engaged to stop. In this game, saving works differently in areas than on the overworld. In areas, the player must seek out these save point tokens to save their progress. On the overworld, they can do so right from the menu. This differentiation helps contrast the two and paints the overworld as a freer place more fitting for adventure. But the trade-off is that the area save points can be more focused and can have specific purposes. Here are two examples of genius save points in this game. The first is in the Golden Saucer and the second is right before Aerith dies. The Golden Saucer is an amusement park, so fittingly, the player must fork over some cash in order to use the save points. This helps sell the area as some sort of casino arcade manipulative extortion hub. The save point right before Aerith dies creates an incentive for the player to retry in hopes of saving her. That makes it so that player-driven repetition is used to hammer home the message that death is an unavoidable part of life. Save points can be a wonderful thing and can truly elevate a game's experience, but I guess that's just my bias. Of the many aspects in a game's critique, about the most subjective is the visual presentation. In this case though, there's a pretty common consensus that for the most part, Final Fantasy VII's visuals lost the struggle against Father Time. For the better part of a year, I've been almost exclusively playing older games to cover on this channel, so I've become very numb to graphical underperformances, but even so, I think this game could take someone a good 5 minutes to adjust to. However, I've frequently expressed that graphics don't age if they have good aesthetics, and I think that's true for this game. 5 minutes spent playing a game is enough for the brain to pick up on the several nuances of that game's visual language, and before the 1 hour mark, an invested player is likely fluent enough to not need to put any effort into understanding what they're seeing. Final Fantasy VII's graphics are that game's highest barrier for entry, but once we've gotten past it, there's a lot to appreciate here. Yoshitaka Amano is another developer person of note. He might be the only person who's been with the Final Fantasy series from the beginning, and if you're unfamiliar with the name, I assure you, you've seen his contributions. For the cover art of this game, Amano designed the famous meteor and had the development team choose between a lot of variations. The one we ended up with was so impactful that it directly influenced the game's color palette. The animators have described the visual tone of the world as dark and weird, which is surprisingly encompassing. The Mako reactors are built with a mixture of metal and cobble of all things. The dirtiest of Midgar slums are littered in junk, ranging from tires to robotic claws. Everything seems in disarray and it helps sell the game's other utility of its visuals, which is something I touched a bit on earlier. They aid in characterization via contrast. We can look at a character from a setting like this, rebelling against the system without needing to question their motives. We can see that the Cetra were pure creatures who lived with the planet because their city was pretty much built into the land. Comparing this to this is enough to see exactly why the characters are fighting. Because of the low detail character models, the game gets away with using the Akira Kurosawa overly expressive body language to present emotions. This is true about animation in general. The less visual detail, the less animation is required to convey expression. The more bells and whistles attached to a character model, the more detail needs to be poured into the animation of said model, or else it'll come across as immensely jarring. The biggest fault I can find with the characters is that they don't always look perfect being superimposed over the pre-rendered backgrounds, and those pre-rendered backgrounds are another can of worms. If you Google search the term pre-rendered backgrounds, the first image you'll see is of Nibelheim. That might in and of itself be the best case to be made about the success of the pre-rendered backgrounds here, but they undeniably do restrain much of what the 3D could have brought to the table. Of course, that's a concession made for the sake of 3D looking crappy back then, and more importantly, the game's cinematic framing style. The game frames shots by emotion and can lead the player's eye to specific points of interest. It's a shame that the resolution of the original release is not up to snuff, because the details poured into the pre-rendered backgrounds are very admirable. There was even some interview I read where they claimed to have made every toilet individually distinct. If true, it's obvious why this launched as the most expensive game of all time. Tetsuya Nomura has described the role of an animator as protecting the player's perspective, and there's a lot of truth to that. The player will ultimately have to experience the game from the perspective the animators offer them, so as middlemen between the player and the mechanics, this observation of Nomura's is very interesting. As a player, however, I just wish that there had been a way for either more details to appear on screen or for the visuals present to have been designed with an understanding of the limitations the game's resolution would ultimately suffer from. This is unfortunately just the fault of the new technology. On a whole, I'd say Final Fantasy VII's visuals are a success story. I've probably been more harsh on them than any other element of the game, but there's undeniably a master touch here. It's always easier to complain, but it's more advantageous to celebrate what works. Like how the animator's understanding of visual contrast enabled Final Fantasy VII to use imagery like this, and have the player know precisely what's going on in that character's head. Akira Kurosawa himself often used similar tricks to get the viewer into his characters' heads. And while he'd often get his actors to incorporate a specific movement or pose into their characters as a means of making them easier to read, some of Final Fantasy VII's characters were designed by looking at a specific movement. Cloud's entire backstory was conceived after the developers saw this shot of him. Everything from his false memories to his distant personality and quiet demeanor. Final Fantasy VII is a role-playing game in the literal sense. To many, role-playing is synonymous with expressive gameplay and branching narrative, but at its core, role-playing is about getting the player to assume a role. Whether expressive playstyles are a good or bad comes down to opinion, but here, there's no denying that by taking a more linear route, Final Fantasy VII was afforded more narrative precision. In the story, Cloud's role as a main protagonist is twofold. One, he links all the other party members together, and two, because he was at one point affiliated with both, he brings a personal stake to the battle against Shinra and Sephiroth. Originally, Cloud was going to have short black hair as a visual contrast against Sephiroth, but the developers decided that an overly masculine protagonist might alienate the player, so he was redesigned to be a spiky-headed blonde. His original design was not scrapped, but rather implemented upon when the developers were designing Zack Fair. In the story, Cloud stole Zack's clothes, sword, attitude, movements, and memories. So Zack getting Cloud's old hair color is somewhat of a sad justice. Another more significant change was to make Zack and Aerith former lovers. The role of Aerith's boyfriend originally belonged to Sephiroth, but even before that, the two were siblings, which explains them sharing a hairstyle. Something which survived throughout most of these changes was that Aerith saw her first boyfriend in Cloud. There are certainly parallels between Cloud and Sephiroth, more on that later, but Zack's inclusion in the story gives the game a lot more replay value than it might have had otherwise. A great thing about the game's simple visuals is that they made going back to alter scenes easier, and because of that, the developers were able to design some of the story as they went on. Places like Gongaga Village benefit greatly from replays because they have different context when the player knows what's really going on. The alignment chart for the characters in this game would paint Sephiroth as a black, Aerith as a white, and Cloud as a grey trying to preserve his world, and later returning balance after the black eliminated the white. I've spent a lot of time emphasizing Aerith's role in this game because I think that's one of its biggest highlights, but as much as I like her, she's still just a supporting character to the central story, which is the rivalry between Cloud and Sephiroth. The feud between the two was originally based on the legendary feud between Samurai Miyamoto Musashi and Sasaki Kojiro, and is pretty cool, but then, when their characters have to frame a cohesive story, things get interesting because Cloud is about as far removed from a reliable narrator as possible, which is revealed in a plot twist. Upon that revelation, the player learns that Sephiroth and Tifa are the only reliable narrators, which makes the player recontextualize their understanding of the events in the story up until that point, which is probably why the developers felt it was necessary to temporarily drop Cloud as the main character. The realization that Cloud had not been chasing Sephiroth as he thought, but rather that he'd been summoned by him, is a big pill for the player to swallow, and it served best to distance the player from him for a bit. As a main protagonist, Cloud does almost everything right. He has the trials of Joseph Campbell's monomyth, but he also subverts the thesis-antithesis-synthesis journey. Thesis is his introduction as he thinks he is, a former member of Soldier with a grudge against Sephiroth. Antithesis is an opposing revelation of what he actually might be, a puppet clone of Sephiroth, one who had been remotely controlled by Sephiroth, manipulating the Jenova cells in his body. Synthesis is when these realities merge, which they don't. Before collapsing under the weight of his identity, Cloud manages, with the help of Tifa, to come to grips with those two realities, and with that understanding can move on to find out who he really is. A kid from Nibelheim whose bravery almost killed Sephiroth once before. Cloud is a warrior capable of protecting the planet because of his triumph over adversity. He mastered his mind so he can carry on without either previous identities serving as a weakness. This occurs in a great scene shortly after Cloud and Tifa fall into the Lifestream due to a weapon attack. Cloud was still in a catatonic state when the two fell in, and the scene has the player control Tifa as she and Cloud pick up the pieces of his shattered psyche. It has them revisit the Nibelheim incident as it actually happened. It showcases their childhood and reveals to the player a brand new identity for Cloud. This happening in the livestream gives it a lot of story significance, like maybe the planet is saving him so he can save it, or maybe Aerith is influencing the livestream to help her friends from beyond. One of Cloud's greatest attributes is that he's a subverted protagonist. He's built up as a cool member of Soldier who fought with but now has a vendetta against Sephiroth. The game actually places Cloud on a pedestal by inviting the comparison between the two. But when the player learns of Cloud's real backstory, he's made all the more sympathetic and it gives him a lot of depth. Something which separates Cloud and Sephiroth is that Cloud can return after all these revelations, and he'll be welcomed back by his friends with open arms. The only one Sephiroth could turn to for that kind of two-sided affection would be his dad, Professor Hojo. However, the blood relationship being a mystery to Sephiroth, in addition to him despising Hojo, would make that an impossibility. Sephiroth has his own subverted thesis-antithesis-synthesis journey. There's his own perceived reality of himself being raised to be a powerful Shinra soldier. The false revelation that his mother and thus himself are Cetra, whose goal is to destroy all life on the planet. And then, instead of these identities merging and him overcoming by mastering both worlds, there's the actual reality of him being Professor Hojo's and Lucretia's son who was injected with Jenova cells as a fetus and raised by Shinra under the assumption that Jenova was a Cetra to lead them to the promised land of Mako energy. It is stated that the best rivals parallel and contrast each other, and as I said earlier, that's certainly true of Cloud and Sephiroth. Cloud is young and passionate, whereas Sephiroth is more mature and cooler. Another interesting contrast between the two of them are their respective mothers. Sephiroth's perceived mother is Jenova, and he wants to destroy the planet for her. Cloud's mother passed away during Sephiroth's rampage, but before that, she was very concerned for her boy. The two of them both meet their mothers during the Nibelheim incident, and both of these meetings are to a degree lies. Jenova is not Sephiroth's mother, and the meeting between Cloud and his mother is blurred from his memory to conceal from himself who he truly is. The game's ending sees the team finally confront the real Sephiroth deep within the northern crater near the center of the planet. To get the players stressed out for this fight, the developers gave them a unique save crystal which could be used once to create a new save point. If they panicked and used it too early, they would themselves decrease their likelihood of success. I guess this would be the third example of a genius use of the save mechanic. This boss battle includes a musical chorus which was written in quite a unique way. Uematsu wrote short snippets, then combined them together in various ways until he was satisfied with a piece. That piece, by the way, was one winged angel. This boss battle also includes a neat trick to play on the players who've been grinding levels. If the player has gotten team members to the maximum level 99, then Sephiroth's stats will be increased. This makes sense in an interesting way. If the player has cared enough to see the team through so many level ups, it makes sense to think that they're more invested and will therefore get more out of a bigger challenge. The Sephiroth battle is threefold. There's Bizarro Sephiroth, Safer Sephiroth, and then Lifestream Sephiroth. The last one is my personal favorite because of its simplicity. The player pushes one button and wins. That works really well in this context because at this point, there's no alternative solutions. Cloud abandoned his body to face Sephiroth in the livestream and end him once and for all. Cloud just has to win. After this fight, he's led back to his body by Aerith, which is when he awakens, escapes the planet core with Tifa, and watches as Aerith guides the livestream up from the ground to repel the meteor long enough for Holy to destroy it. For Final Fantasy VII, the characters open up new avenues of reading the world. Their variability enables more expressive freedom by setting up the team in different ways, and their origins are all very diverse. So diverse in fact that by making the characters so engaging, the developers got the player to care about their origins. The story, the world, and the entire game works because that bond is so strong. If there is a game that has to be played to understand, it's Final Fantasy VII. From the outside, this might seem like a weird nostalgia-driven love that's only sustained by the superfans, but take the time and actually give it a shot on its own terms, and you might feel today what players felt back in 1997. Something this game has, which more games are starting to embrace today, is kid-friendly maturity. Mature enough to be approachable to children and adults. This is an attribute synonymous with the Pixar animation studio, and it makes it so that the product has near universal appeal. With that appeal, Final Fantasy VII solidified the West's love affair with JRPGs, and it launched just in time to change the landscape. It followed the story of a former Shinra guard with memory issues, turned into a terrorist for cash, only to eventually grow to truly appreciate and want to preserve life. Cloud and the gang have remained prevalent characters because they all showcase an aspect of that underlying theme, living. Whether it's identity, fatherhood, dreams, redemption, learning, love, guilt, or pride. Living for death or dying for life. The final shot of this game occurs 500 years after the events of the story and showcases Red 13 observing the vegetation-ridden ruins of Midgar. If we discount the external media surrounding this game, then we're witnessing a very ambiguous ending. Did the humans learn from their mistakes, and did they start living with the planet? Did the planet awaken more weapons to destroy them after the meteor was stopped? Did the humans maybe kill each other later in some useless war? We don't really know. All we know is that the planet survived, thanks to a group of terrorists who refused to give up. And that is what Final Fantasy VII has to teach about game design. Stories are driven not by objects or events, but by characters. Thanks for watching. In this video, we went over Final Fantasy VII in depth. We explored the story, the characters, and the mechanics. We learned about how jumping ship, Square forced Nintendo to double down on their exclusives whilst simultaneously paving the way for Sony, arguably the first competitor worthy of Nintendo's time, and I hope you can walk away from this video with something to think about. The footage you've been watching was applied by World of Longplays, as played by Rikichi and Valis77, and the music was applied by Symphonic Remasters. If you enjoyed this video, I implore you to leave a like, share, and if you're new to the channel, be sure to subscribe. Final Fantasy VII is one of the most important video games of all time, historically and culturally speaking. To be more important to the medium is a hard case for any game to make, but not impossible. I'm Icer Aesthetics, and next time we'll be analyzing the best of the best. Hope to have you aboard.